Well, thanks once again for joining us today.
My pleasure.
If my research serves me correctly, I see that you were born in 1939 in Cleveland, Ohio, and I was wondering if you could start at the beginning and tell us about your family background for both your mother and your father.
Sure. Well, you're correct. I was, in fact, born in Cleveland, Ohio. My mother and father were a little bit older when I was born. My dad was almost 40. My mother was in her mid-30s. So I'm an only child. My parents were not educated past the 8th grade formally. My mother did take some business courses before she married, but my dad did not. He started working because he was the oldest in his family of 6 when he was 14, and he was actually delivering fish for his uncle who had a fish market in Cleveland. And then he eventually followed what his father was doing. My grandfather was a letterpress photo engraver, and my father became one as well. And he did that for most of in fact, all the time I knew him. He was in that, working in that industry, making the copper plates that were used for high-quality printing, things like the Sears catalog, and mostly advertising for magazines like Life and Look and others of the times. My mother, as I said, took some business courses, and so she knew how to type and do shorthand. And she was lucky enough to get a job working as a clerk in the bankruptcy court of Cleveland for the head of the bankruptcy bank. And this was in the Depression, and she was the second oldest of 9, and the only one who was employed full-time during the Depression. So she really did a lot to help her family financially. When my parents met and they decided to get married, my dad had been married before. Unfortunately, his first wife died in childbirth, and they never had any children. We lived in a part of Cleveland that was a very nice neighborhood. My parents are both Roman Catholic, so I went to Catholic school. Started Our Lady of the Angels, and then we migrated a little further out into the suburbs and went to a school called St. Angela's. And when I was ready to go to high school, it was the first time that I can recall making a decision that my parents weren't entirely supportive of. They had selected a high school for me, a Catholic high school called St. Edward's. It was in a nice part of Cleveland. But my best friends from elementary school were deciding to go to a Jesuit high school in Cleveland called St. Ignatius, and it was in a fairly tough part of town. So we debated that, and eventually they allowed me to do that, and it was probably the best decision I ever made in my life. The reason being that the Jesuit philosophy of education is to push really hard in the liberal arts and the sciences and mathematics. So I took 4 years of Latin, 2 years of Greek, all the math courses that they offered, and a physics course. And when I was getting towards my senior year in high school, I was so respectful of the Jesuits that I decided that that's what I would do. I would become a Jesuit priest. And my parents were very supportive, although probably a little disappointed. So I went off to study to become a Jesuit. The seminary was down in a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio, called Milford. And the Jesuits spend roughly 15 years in training. You get your undergraduate and graduate degrees. You get your courses in philosophy and theology. You spend 3 years usually teaching at one of the Jesuit high schools, and then you get ordained a priest, and then you get your full-time occupation, whatever that might be. And a large percentage of the Jesuits stayed in education at the university level and so forth. Well, after a little over 3 years, the Society of Jesus and I made a good decision, and I decided I wasn't going to continue trying to be a Jesuit. And so I left. I came back home. My cousin's husband found me a job working in a valve plant in Cleveland, stocking goods and that, until I could start college. And I decided to go back to a Jesuit school in Cincinnati called Xavier University, and that's where I began my undergraduate degree.
Could I ask you a few follow-up questions about this?
Of course.
With your father's work, was he working for like a large printing company, or was it a smaller kind of independent shop, or what was that like?
Right, it was the name of the company was called Acme Photo Engraving. They were a small company, probably 20 employees. Yeah, but the work that they did would go to places like R.R. Donnelley in Chicago and other major printers. And most of the time, the people who were judging whether his work was ready to go out were people who were in the advertising industry and were paying for advertisements. And so he had, as he used to tell me, they told me the purple had to be a little sexier. And I said, I didn't know what that meant, but I made it sexier. And he'd do that by taking a pumice stone and rubbing the copper halftone plate and getting the magenta to come up a little higher. And so it was fascinating for me to watch. It was very toxic. He worked with cyanide, benzenes, and around etching baths, and a lot of the people who worked in that industry did not have long lives. They died of cancer, and they're typically in their 50s or 60s. My dad was very fortunate. He must have had the right genes. He lived to be almost 99 years old, and so I had the great pleasure of having him around for a long time.
Was his entrance into that profession kind of like through an apprenticeship to learn this very skillful kind of hands-on craft practice? Was it almost like an apprenticeship through his father that he came into?
Yeah, he didn't actually apprentice under his father, but he did have a journeyman who apprenticed him, and it's a 6-year period. They were part of a union, and the union was an AFL union, and the AFL was typically very focused on educating people in the trades. And so we would often go in the summer to their annual convention. It would be in New York or Chicago or Baltimore or someplace. And in addition to having discussions about the union and the negotiations for their benefits and salaries, a lot of it had to do with having formal sort of classes to help them stay current and understand where the industry was going. And I remember my dad telling me when I was graduating from college, he said, Chuck, he didn't never call me Chuck. That came from my wife. If I was in good grace, I was Charlie. If I was causing a problem, I was Charles. But at any rate, he'd say, Charlie, I really never want you to go into the printing business. He said, it's a very toxic business, and I think it's going to change, and I think you would do better to stick to the books. And that was both his and my mother's philosophy. They were very adamant that I get as much education as possible.
That was my next question. was curious about, sometimes there's a real kind of like theme in a household, you know, some interest or that really characterizes the household, and sometimes that's religion, and sometimes that's sort of politics or maybe union involvement, sometimes education or art or the sciences. And sometimes, most often, it's a blend of those things. How would you characterize like what your household was like?
Both of my parents read a lot. Some of it was, you know, for pleasure, but a lot of it had to do with politics and other things. They were both very, very strong Democrats. In fact, my uncle was what was called a ward healer at one of the wards in Cleveland. And so politics was a part of our conversations often. They were very loyal Catholics. We never missed Mass on Sunday. They were, in fact, my great-grandfather was a member of the Third Order of St. Francis, which is for lay people, but they actually give him a ceremonial robe that makes him look like a Franciscan, and when he was buried in that outfit. And the parish that we went to, Our Lady of the Angels, was actually a Franciscan parish, and a lot of my family went to that parish.
I was wondering.
So that was a strong ingredient. And even though my parents didn't have a formal education, they were very committed not only to educating themselves, but more importantly to educating me. And if I did not get an A in a class, I heard about it.
You became Charles.
Then I became Charles.
Yeah. Was the library a big part then of your access to books?
Well, it's fascinating you asked that because, of course, this is way before Kindle and Amazon and all of that. There was a very good public library not terribly far from where we lived, although I think I ended up having to take a bus to get to it. I rode the bus to school. It cost 2 cents each way, different times. At any rate, but I would go to that library and I would spend hours just going through the shelves and finding things that interest me. I wouldn't necessarily take the book out, but I would go through it for a while, try to learn something. And not just in things that were like science, but also in history. I was very interested in history and in actually the evolution of society from the pre-Christ era all the way through. A lot of what Jesuits teach is ancient history, and so that always fascinated me.
And were you a known character to the librarians? Sometimes they can be encouraging, and sometimes they can be dissuading.
No, I kept a pretty low profile. And I always return my books on time.
And what did you have? Both your father and your mother came from large families, lots of with their siblings. Right. Was that extended family also local in Cleveland or in Ohio? Or?
Yes. Even though I was an only child, I had 30 first cousins because of two big families. And at least 3 or 4 times a week, we would end up spending an evening visiting one of my aunts or uncles and my cousins. And so they were really part of in effect, my siblings, right, even though they didn't live with me. And we used to spend a lot of time going to picnics and a variety of different things as a family. So that was also a very important part of my young life.
Were you in your reading for? Were you reading for pleasure, novels, science fiction, anything like that? Did that figure into your life?
I never read anything in science fiction in general, but I did read a lot of historic novels.
Mm-hmm.
I read War and Peace in French because I was teaching myself French.
As a young person in high
Well,
school
relative.
aged,
I was in college by then, but
okay.
yeah, not high school. That's be a little extreme.
Yeah.
And my undergraduate degree in college, because of the time I spent studying to be a Jesuit, I'd taken so much Latin and Greek that my undergraduate degree is in Latin.
Right. I did see
Probably
that.
the only executive in Silicon Valley who can say that. But I took as much mathematics as I could, and I got a master's in math 1 year after I finished my bachelor's.
Right. How in thinking about Cleveland while you were growing up there in the 1940s and 1950s, can you tell us about your impressions of Cleveland in those decades? Was it vibrant in terms of industry? And I know there was a lot of kind of aeronautics going on nearby. What was Cleveland like for you in those years?
It was an amazing mixture of both cultures and business. We lived about 2 miles away from the NASA Ames laboratory next to the Cleveland airport.
Right.
And so a lot of the work that was being done in space was being done there. And the reason that facility ended up there is partly because of a fairly significant sized airport, but also because that's where the tanks were all built, or not, I shouldn't say all, but many of the tanks were built for World War II, and so they had these huge buildings, which they were able to use at very modest reconditioning costs. And so NASA Ames was there, which was a big part of aerospace, obviously. Half a dozen major steel mills along the Cuyahoga River. And so it's interesting when people would get up in the morning, they sort of wanted to see a little smoke. Because if things were smoking, it meant there was work.
Right. Yeah.
So sort of an anachronistic thing. Cleveland also had a tremendous influx of immigrants. Both of my parents' families ended up in Cleveland, and they were from Germany. Actually, my mother's father was from Austria.
Mm-hmm.
He came because he didn't want to fight for the Kaiser. And he met his eventual wife, who was my grandmother, in New York, and he worked in the lumber industry, sharpening saws. He was a metal worker, and my grandmother ran the places that housed the workers. And when they got to the point where my mother and her older sister, which were only a year apart, were ready to go to school, my grandmother put her foot down and said, we're not going to keep living in, they were originally in northern Pennsylvania and then in West Virginia. We need to get to a city, and somehow they picked Cleveland. And so they ended up there. My father's family had come directly to Cleveland. In fact, my father's father was born on board ship coming from Bremen to New York. So it was always a little cloudy about his citizenship, but not a problem. They all came in through Ellis Island, and they all became citizens. Different world then. But where my mother's family lived, it was on the edge of a Hungarian neighborhood, the largest Hungarian community outside of Budapest.
Oh, I had no
A
idea.
huge migration of that. There was a big Polish contingent, and my wife's family were all Irish, and there was an area that they referred to as the Irish Ghetto at St. Rose's Parish. And Detroit Avenue. And so that's the part of the city. It was all intermixed, and of course there was a huge African American community as well. And so I got to experience the pluses and minuses, of course, of how those people were dealt with. And it was a little sobering sometimes to hear conversations that people had about the African Americans, and they used the N-word sometimes when they referred to them, and
Right.
so on. So that was a little sobering to see, very sobering.
Do you think that growing up in that kind of diverse context was formative for you in ways?
Absolutely. I mean, what I saw was that people from every culture and every background could make major contributions. And so it never seemed to me that you needed to be a white Anglo-Saxon in order to be a great scientist or to be a creative artist or an excellent journalist. You could be any of those backgrounds. It really all had to do with your commitment as both a student and as a expert in whatever field you decided to undertake. And that certainly influenced the way both my partner, John Warnock, and I felt when we started Adobe, is that we were going to hire people who were incredibly smart. Always told, and you'll hear this from me a couple times probably in this interview, you hire people who are smarter than you are because it's the largest community from which you can recruit. And that was our attitude. Never thought about it. And if you walked through the halls of Adobe today, you'd think you were at the UN.
Did you, just going forward a bit, when you created Adobe and had this orientation, a positive orientation toward diversity in the 1980s, did you feel at that time or subsequently that was really setting your operation apart?
I never thought about it that way. We didn't do it to be different. We did it to be successful. And we wanted to build a company that we would want to work at. And that's the kind of company John and I wanted to work at. So that's why we did it.
Right. But I guess what I was wondering is...
there was a lot of diversity going on even then in Silicon Valley. We did not invent this concept, but we certainly approached it with no fear or no uncertainty. It was something that we thought was the right thing to do.
Well, going back to Cleveland in the 40s and 50s, how did the more broader experience of the city and the nation with the Second World War and the Cold War, did that come into your consciousness very much?
Oh, it did, but as a kid, I had to get under my desk, like that was going to help if an atom bomb fell. I'm not sure why we did it. Well, I know why they did it. They wanted us to be aware of the international risks that we potentially could have suffered. But in terms of getting us through it, I don't think it would have mattered. I was always sort of aware of all of that, but I never focused a lot on it. Several of my uncles fought in World War II, and fortunately all of them got through it, came home, which was wonderful. No, I can't say it was a major factor in my life.
Mm-hmm. In thinking about your experiences inside the classroom through high school, did your academic studies come easy to you? Was that did you feel comfortable in your academic studies? I know your parents had a goal for you for excellent marks, but was it a struggle or did it come easy?
I don't know about easy, but it felt, I felt very confident. Part of the reason is the Jesuits organized the classrooms, what today you would call, I guess, your homeroom, by academic level. And even though my initial class was referred to as 1F, there's 1A through 1F, within maybe not hours, but certainly within a day or two, we figured out that we were the number one class. And the people who were sitting next to me are people who became friends for life. And, they got, a guy sat next to me, John Mansfield, got a Ph.D. in physics and actually was very active in the government in terms of science and so forth. So these were the kind of people that were around you, and so you felt like if you needed any help, you could just talk to one of them and they would help you figure it out. And so I didn't feel afraid or scared. And I certainly felt supported and encouraged at home, even though my parents couldn't help me with my math or any of those things, but that was fine. And actually, one of the kids who was in my class lived a block away in the suburb that we lived in, so he and I would sometimes get together if we had something that we were trying to figure out. It's just the way it worked.
And what was the attraction for St. Ignatius? In this different part of town, but you had friends who wanted to go there. Was it seen as to the youths as the best school, or what was the attraction?
The attraction for me was in fact that my closest friends were going there. Number one. Number two, it did have a reputation in Cleveland for being good in athletics. That's a big deal in high school. But it also had a reputation for getting kids into college and starting them on the path to higher education. So those were sort of the reasons. The Jesuits themselves were also an attraction because, as I think I mentioned earlier, part of their training was they would spend 3 years before they were priests. So they were typically those people were in their late 20s, and they were part of the faculty. So they were young, they were energetic, and they were sort of role models, and that was very attractive.
I was just circling the word mentors on my question list, and I wondered if, sometimes people in their high school experience, there's a key adult that acts as sort of a mentor that is influential. I wonder, was there a person like that?
Yeah, there was
you?
a scholastic at St. Ignatius. His name was Joseph McPartland, and he was very helpful to me. And I used to go to him when I had things I was struggling with, and not necessarily just academics, but just generally. And he would talk with me, and he was very easy to get along with. There was another one who was another scholastic who was around when I was a freshman and sophomore that I also went to a lot. His name was Jim O'Reilly. And I kept correspondence with him. He just passed away a couple of years ago, but he would still write me letters, and I would write him letters. And so he was a friend for life.
When you were, as you were getting toward the end of your high school experience, and you start to seriously consider the seminary, were you talking about that idea and that choice with people at school or at your parish church, or who were you talking to about that?
It turned out there were 8 of us who graduated from St. Ignatius in my class, all of whom entered the Jesuits.
Oh, wow.
So we had a community of people right there to talk to. One of them was that physicist I mentioned earlier, who was a very good friend. He was valedictorian of our class. So these were people I respected, I liked, and so we were sort of doing it as a group in some sense. Mm-hmm. And that was probably the primary enabler of my coming to peace with that decision. The other thing, I hadn't mentioned this, but when we moved from the part of Cleveland, I mentioned we were at Our Lady of the Angels out to St. Angela's, that was a move from sort of the suburban, not a suburb, it was part of Cleveland, but then we moved into a suburb called Fairview Park, which had been an agricultural community until the end of World War II when they started to develop it. And so the kids in that school were a little behind education-wise. And the nuns decided I should skip a grade. And unfortunately, my mother agreed with them, and so I skipped a grade. And I say unfortunately because looking back on it, while at the time I thought, wow, that's pretty cool, what I didn't realize is that would put me behind everyone in terms of maturity. And that caused a little bit of stress in my life, which I didn't really realize until I was older. But
what was your age when you were graduating from high school then?
16.
Okay, so that is young.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a young age to make a decision. Yeah. Okay, right. I get it. And I was just wondering, but it's a decision that 7 others of your cohort were also making.
Right. They were all a year older than I.
But I was just wondering if there was something about the time, something more, something about that moment in history that would lead people to that, or maybe that would have been a typical sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't think it had anything to do with external factors. It really had to do with a respect and affection for the Jesuit community who was teaching us and wanting to follow them as role models. I think that was by far the largest attraction.
And was well, before we get to that, I just wanted to know if did you have work experiences while you were young? Did you?
I cut lawns. Nothing particularly
just
dramatic.
Well, then so you were at the seminary that you attended, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of it.
It was in a town called Milford, so it was referred to as the Milford. That's what it was called.
And you were there for 3 years, did you say?
Actually, 3 years. And at the end of the 3rd year, the Jesuits had been expanding, and so they divided this, and they were organized geographically into things called provinces. And this province that it started in was called the Chicago province. And they decided, not terribly long after I entered the seminary, that they were going to divide into two provinces, the Detroit province and the Chicago province. And since came up, and Ohio was going to be part of the Detroit province. So they built a new seminary up outside Pontiac, Michigan. It was called Columbier. And so those of us who were from the Detroit province migrated up there. And so I spent my last 6 months up there. And it turns out that all of the people that I entered with from Cleveland were in the Detroit province, so the ones who were still in came up there as well. So it wasn't that I got divorced from them, but it just by then I was beginning to question whether I was really making a good decision for myself, and candidly whether I was capable of being really a good priest. And I didn't want to have that uncertainty to live with.
Right. And do you think, was it the case that, forgive my ignorance about it, but was it the case that this was an expected process for people to go through? That, that people would discover, that the fit wasn't correct, and they would move on.
It was. I mean, obviously they wanted to retain the people who had started. I mean, nobody was pushing us out. I guess you could have been pushed out if you were doing something that they were unhappy with.
Right.
But that wasn't the case with me. So they really wanted to retain me, and in fact, they moved me for the last couple of months. I moved into a high school in Detroit and began teaching Latin to high school kids, just because they wanted to give me another experience in the case that might encourage me, but it didn't, and so I still left.
And then you returned to Cleveland, got the job in the valve manufacturing plant. And now, you mentioned your then future wife, Nancy, that she was also, growing up in Cleveland. Was it around that time of your return to Cleveland after the seminary that you met her? No, that was later. That's still in the future.
That's still in the future.
Okay.
I did not leave because I had somehow knew about her.
No. I was just wondering about the timing of when you met. So while you were working, thinking of your next steps, how were you? What were you thinking about your different options for, going to college?
Well, I had some exposure to Xavier University in Cincinnati because a couple of times we did field trips to work with underprivileged people in the city of Cincinnati while I was at Milford.
Okay.
And so I got a little bit of exposure to it. And it was a Jesuit university. It was away from home. I knew I didn't want to be living at home in college.
Right.
Something we always encouraged with our kids as well. And so it just was sort of a logical choice for me. And so I applied for admission, got in, and and the counseling said, well, you might as well get your degree in Latin because you got so much of it. And I said, yeah, but I really want to study primarily mathematics. And they said, fine, we can accelerate you through that. And the man who was the chairman of the math department at Xavier, Father Ray Allen, took a liking to me and he had me taking both freshman and junior courses at the same time. And actually I took a graduate course while I was a senior, and I ended up getting a scholarship for my master's by doing some teaching. And so I was well taken care of.
Can you talk about, the attraction to mathematics? Were you a person who, was that about puzzle solving? Sometimes people will, that is a certain attraction. There's kind of an aesthetics. I'd just be interested in what was.
I think it was just the whole process of having an abstract conception that you can expand upon and learn from, and then eventually apply in the real world. And it was just fascinating to me. I always had been. As soon as I took my first algebra course in high school, I was just really attracted to it. And I don't think I really thought about it so much intellectually as I was just instinctively following something I enjoyed doing.
Right. And for how long were you at the university?
At Xavier?
Yeah.
2 years as an undergraduate and 1 year as a graduate student, so a total of 3 years.
Okay. And what was your life like in those years outside of the classroom? Did you have any time for hobbies? You had a scholarship for at least part of it, so you didn't have to.
Right. Well, I did not have a scholarship as an undergraduate. Fortunately, the tuition was only $300 a semester. It's a little different than when I look at what my grandchildren are paying to go to college. So I actually ended up living in a community of people who were interested in doing Catholic social action activity. The word for it was the sodality, and we had a house. And rather than going to live in a dorm, I ended up living in this house. And at the time, I think I was the oldest person in the house. Now all of a sudden I was the older side instead of the younger side. And so I ended up signing the lease, and we had 30 people living in this house, and we hired a woman who was a single mother, and she had a kid still in grade school and going to high school, about to go to high school. And so she was our cook, and we had dinner 5 days a week, and had a place where we could do our own breakfast and lunch if we wanted to, or whatever. We lived in this house.
What were the issues around which the social action was directed?
Mostly at looking to help people who were poor, people who were having social problems, and trying to offer them some kind of support. Mm-hmm. We would go out into Cincinnati periodically and go into some neighborhoods, mostly African American, and talk to people and try and see if we could encourage them to make sure they took good care of their kids and things like that. Mm. So it was very much on that sort of aspect of life.
Yeah, so mainly poverty and associated
things
difficulties that were caused or exacerbated by poverty. And was that part of a larger national movement?
Yes. Many of the Catholic colleges, including the one my wife went to in Detroit, Marygrove College, had these sodalities, and they would work together and occasionally get together for meetings to talk about what they were doing so that they could share experiences and co-develop new ideas about how to deal with things. And that's actually how I met my wife at one of those congresses that we had.
Of sodality.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Mm.
And her grouping was similarly devoted to these issues about poverty. And then you must have discovered that you had this
things in common.
Right.
We found out that when we were about 5 years old, we lived 3 blocks apart in Cleveland, took piano lessons from the same piano teacher, but we never met. I'm about 3 years older than Nan, so, and then elementary school, that's a big gap. So,
sure.
But we certainly bought popsicles at the same corner market, Dennis's Market, so we know we must have met. Yeah. We just didn't.
That's a solid foundation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so did you prepare a thesis for your master's degree, or was that?
Yes.
Yeah. What was interesting you at that time?
It was in differential equations, sort of abstract differential equations, and my advisor was one of the people in the math department, and he helped me work through it. And I did well enough to get my degree.
And then what was your thinking for your next step from there?
Well, I'd pretty much decided that I wanted to get a Ph.D. in math. And the most straightforward way to do that, since I didn't have any other way to pay for it, was I would get a job teaching, and I was going to move back to Cleveland and teach at a Jesuit school, John Carroll University, which actually had started out as St. Ignatius College, and then it split and moved to a different part of the city. And I got a job in the math department, and the chairman of the department was the same Jesuit who had helped me at Xavier, so it was a very easy interview for me. And one of my friends from Xavier was a year older than, well, he was a year younger than I, but a year ahead of me in school. He had gone to teach at John Carroll, and he had started working on his Ph.D. at Case Western Reserve. And so he got me to go there, and I got in and started working on my Ph.D. at Case Western Reserve while I was teaching.
Okay, I see.
While I was married, and we got married while I was teaching.
And was it the case that at Case Western that because you had the master's degree, you weren't doing any more coursework? You could just move? No,
there were some coursework, but I approached and was accepted as a student to be advised by one of the full-time professors there. And so I wasn't ready to start my thesis, but I was moving in that direction.
And did your interest in differential equations continue? Or
yes, it did, actually. Okay. And that happened, the reason I got to work with it is that was sort of his field. Mm-hmm. So.
And was there any in your work on differential equations? I know that they kind of have sort of a special place in the history of computing with all of these different sorts of mechanical aids to computation that were developed for handling differential equations,
right.
and then also.
Yeah, now this was much more abstract.
Right.
My thesis topic was going to be an examination of differential equations on Banach spaces.
I'm not familiar with.
I'm no longer familiar with that either. But I still remember the title.
Right. Okay. So very, math for math's sake.
Very math
sort
for
of.
math's sake, yes,
Okay.
not applied math.
Right. And how did you find the teaching?
I
Your own teaching.
thoroughly enjoyed it. And from feedback that I got after I left John Carroll and went back to graduate school at Carnegie Mellon, some of my students wrote me notes, and obviously had a positive impact on them, I think. But I really enjoyed teaching, and I didn't like the life of a university professor, however. Reason being that it seemed like when we got together, we talked more about the politics of the university than about anything else, and who was going to get that next big corner office. And I don't want to oversimplify it, and I don't want to make it overly negative, but it wasn't what I sort of expected. And so when I was finishing my Ph.D., I decided I would not go back to teaching, that I would go into research.
Oh, you had made that determination even before you went to.
While I was at Carnegie Mellon.
While you were at Carnegie Mellon.
Yeah.
I see. Well, perhaps we could talk about how, I guess it's in this period of time that the computing comes into your life.
Yes. It's a, Nan sometimes chastises me. She says, "You tell everybody that story. I've heard it so many times." But it is a fascinating story. At least I think it is.
Please.
So I'm going to bore you and the audience with it.
Please do.
We had a faculty meeting after I'd been teaching there about almost 4 years, going over our we offered master's degrees at John Carroll, and I taught some of the courses as part of that graduate program. And we were talking about the graduate students and how they were doing and where they were in terms of progressing to complete their degrees. And we decided that one of the students just was not cutting it. He tried hard. He's a good guy. Everybody liked him, but he just didn't seem to have it. And so we were going to have to advise him that it was time for him to do something else. We literally, I don't think it was straws, but we drew pencils or whatever we did, and I got the short one. So this is the first time in my life I ever had to do something, the equivalent of like firing somebody.
Right.
So I said, "Oh God, how am I going to do this?" And I said, "Well, the only thing I can think of is I guess I'll talk to him the way I would want him to talk to me if our roles were reversed." What else to do? So I brought him into my office, I explained to him, and told him that he could be very successful, but it was just not going to be in mathematics, and at least not in getting an advanced degree in mathematics. Oh, he was disappointed, and he left. And about a year later, he called me, and he said, "I'd like to have him come and see you." And I said, "Fine." And after I hung up the phone, I thought, I hope this year went well. This could be a very painful conversation. He comes into my office with a big grin on his face. He said, "Best thing you ever did is kick me out of here, Mr. Geschke." He said, "I got a job selling computers for General Electric." Probably a lot of people who are watching this didn't even remember that General Electric was in the computer business, but they were, and they had a big sales division in Cleveland. And he said, "I just had to come by and thank you." He said, "You've made such a difference in my life by doing this." And he said, "And I've been trying to think of how I could really show you how much I appreciate it. And it occurred to me, would you like to learn how to program a computer?" I said, "Yeah." So he came by evenings and weekends over the summer and taught me how to program in FORTRAN. And I really enjoyed it. We had a couple of old GE computers at John Carroll, and when my second child, our daughter Kathy, was born, I actually wrote a program to print out birth announcements on a line printer and put them in envelopes with a window with the address in them. And, at any rate, my wife Nan noticed that I was having a lot more fun with this than my math education. And she said to me, she said, "You know, Chuck, if that's what you really enjoy, that's what you should do. And I think it's important you follow your instincts in something like that." I said, "Nan, we don't have any money." And I was paid as a faculty member, but not very well. I mean, as well as anybody on the faculty,
Right.
but it wasn't a lot of money. We, by then, had 2 children. I said, "How are we going to do this?" She said, "We'll figure it out. Don't worry about that. You have to follow your dream." You can see that I married extremely well. I said, "Well, okay." So I went and talked to my advisor at Case, who had actually gotten his Ph.D. in math from Carnegie Tech. And he said, "Well, okay, I can understand that you might want to change fields." He said, "I really think you ought to go down and talk to the people at Carnegie, because I hear they're doing some really interesting stuff." And he said, "Call them up, make an appointment." So I did. It happened to be right around this date in history when Martin Luther King was killed. And things in Cleveland were a little tough. There we had National Guard troops and everything. And I'm driving off to Pittsburgh to meet with the chairman of the computer science department. And we had a good conversation. He looked at the paperwork that I gave him, and he said, "Well, it's a little unusual." He said, "We don't ever have anybody who gets his degree in Latin come here." He said, "But you did really well in the GRE. You aced it." I said, "Well, I've been teaching it for 5 years. I did GRE in math."
Right.
He said, I said, "I had to do this." He said, "Yeah, oh yeah." He said, "Well, you know, at Carnegie, we sort of like to have people from different backgrounds." And he said, "I'll give you an ARPA scholarship and you can come back to school." So we did.
And that would
1968.
1968. And I think that for many, today in 2018, there's a lot of discussion about people pursuing education in computer science. I think it was quite a different, far more unusual in 1968. Could you speak
There were
to
almost no classes for undergraduates that had anything to do with computers. It was only a graduate program. Even at Carnegie, they may have had something like Introduction to Computers or something, but it wasn't much.
that? Right. So it was probably, in some ways, even more unusual than someone pursuing a PhD in mathematics to pursue a PhD.
Oh, much more unusual, yeah. Carnegie was one of the very first schools in the United States to offer a PhD in computer science.
And also at that time, ARPA, it is my impression that ARPA was the primary sponsor of computer science research and education.
ARPA was the best investment the U.S. government has ever made, as far as I'm concerned. If you look at the lineage of Silicon Valley, almost everyone was touched by ARPA, and many of us were educated. Both I and my partner, John Warnock, were both ARPA students, he at the University of Utah, and I was one at Carnegie. And it made a tremendous difference, not just in our personal lives, but when I eventually took my first job after finishing my degree at the Xerox Research Center in Palo Alto, the Xerox PARC, the fellow who was recruiting was a guy named Bob Taylor, who unfortunately has just passed away. And he was the head of ARPA, the third head of ARPA. And so he knew where we all were. And that's why PARC had that incredible gold mine of researchers, because they were all ARPA people.
Right. And there was, and I've heard many people talk about, use the phrase the ARPA community, because there really was this occasions for the ARPA researchers to get together, to meet one another, both principal investigators and
Well, that was
graduates.
part of their philosophy, was that ARPA institutions, both the research labs, because there were a few of them, but certainly the educational labs, were responsible for helping their graduates build a network. And it was also the case that whatever research was done by members of the ARPA community was not proprietary to the institution. It had to be shared with everyone, and had to be actively disclosed and published about. And so they really were building a sort of nest egg of talent and research that changed the whole field. In fact, well, it helped establish the field. Really.
Right. Was there, when you got to Carnegie Mellon, was there a sense of kind of excitement in the computer science department? Was there, what was it?
Yeah.
What did it feel like?
Well, that computer science department had three principal people. And now we're going to test Chuck's memory, whether I can get the names right. The chairman of the department was Alan Perlis, who was a wonderful guy. He's the fellow who let me get in. Alan Newell, who was one of the seminal founders of artificial intelligence. And, oh God, from the business school, Herb Simon. So that triumvirate are the people who actually started computer science at Carnegie Mellon, and they're really legends in the field. Everybody who's worked in the field knew them and knew of what they had done. And so it was fantastic, and I was lucky enough that I was assigned to a brand new faculty member who just showed up, a fellow by the name of Bill Wulf, who eventually did all sorts of things, including the National Academy. But he took me under his wing, and he said, I'm a freshman here, and you're a freshman here, and I'm going to make sure you figure out how to get through all this. And he ended up being my thesis advisor, and I owe him a great deal. He was a great guy.
I was looking at that about him in preparation for this, and I reckoned that you both would have been pretty much the same age.
We were.
Yeah, so it was, I would imagine that would make it very, very collegial.
Right.
Yeah.
And he had a couple of kids, and we actually had another child born while I was a graduate student, which was a mild surprise. And at any rate, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's see. And so it was the case that Carnegie Mellon was really the only computer science program that you looked at.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't go anywhere else.
So through Bill Wulf, you were introduced to the Bliss project to create a new programming language. Could you tell us a little bit more about the program and the people the effort and the people with whom you worked.
Sure. Well, Bill had a feeling that computers were starting to get to the point where they were fast enough and memory sizes were getting big and less expensive. And it was time to think about programming systems on computers without using assembly language. Back in those days, most operating systems were developed in an assembly language because the belief was that was the only way to make the code really fast and efficient and small. And so his philosophy was that we could do something just as well by coming up with a language that was a higher level language, and that we could build an optimizing compiler that could produce code that would be good, I'll say good enough or competitive with what you could do by hand. He named it Bliss for the basic language for implementing systems. And he had a visiting professor named Don Russell who had come from England. And two of us as graduate students, Dave Weil and myself, and the four of us began working on designing the language and then eventually working on building the compiler that would be an optimizing compiler for it. And that work began sometime in the middle of, towards the end of 1968, and it was going full steam by the summer of 1969 because I actually was hired as a research assistant for those 3 months in the summer to work on the project, along with the other three people, Bill Wulf, Don Russell, and Dave Weil. And we continued to develop the language, and I started working, sort of took a leadership role in building the compiler. And actually, because the techniques for building an optimizing compiler were sort of known, there were some researchers at IBM and other places who had looked into how to make compilers much more intelligent. But I saw that as an opportunity for a potential thesis topic. And Bill agreed with it. He said, yeah, if you could do something really creative in this area, that'd be worth getting your Ph.D. thesis out of it. And so in addition to working on the project to actually build this compiler and finish the design of the language and so forth, I was in effect also working on what would eventually be my thesis. And it turned out that that was in fact my thesis. It was on doing optimization, and I came up with a sort of language for how to describe what the optimizing compiler could do, and on, and that was my thesis.
And so that would have been...
My thesis was published in the late summer of 1972.
Okay.
4 years after I had started at Carnegie.
And it was, I took a look at a part of it, a sample that I was able to access, and it seemed, tell me if I was getting this right, that it seemed like it was more of a general study of ways to analyze or understand optimizing compilers in general.
Right.
Okay.
It wasn't tied exclusively to Bliss, but the sort of laboratory proof of its success was that that's the way we implemented the optimizing compiler for Bliss, and it was in fact a very good compiler.
And when I was, truth be told, when I was talking to somebody else to actually make sure that I was understanding what an optimizing compiler was, they said, well, was it optimizing for kind of compaction, low memory, the code was small, or was it optimizing for speed, of the speed of execution?
It was mostly for size.
For size, okay.
And the idea being that smaller programs run faster because
There's fewer instructions.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And was in the, and another question I had about the Bliss programming language was it the case that in the design of the programming language, was that somehow influenced with the idea that the language would go through one of these optimizing compilers? That is to say, were you, in a way, tuning the language so it could be optimized, or were those two entirely separate?
They were pretty much separate.
Okay. So one is, what's a good language for writing systems?
Right.
The other is optimizing.
Optimizing the
Okay.
result.
And was the, what did you learn from working on that project in terms of, doing an effort like this in computer science, working on a new language?
Well, it's interesting, I think, about Carnegie. One of the differentiators of it as a school in computer science is that they typically got students involved in doing projects with other graduate students in small units, because that, in fact, is what you would end up doing when you went out to work after you got your degree. So in some sense, they were prototyping not only your individual knowledge, but how you would use your knowledge in the field once you finished your degree. And so the team of people who worked on Bliss was bigger than just the people I mentioned. It wasn't dramatically bigger, but there were other people who were working on some of the coding and doing some of the other things. And that's very much the way, once I left Carnegie and went to Xerox PARC, that's the way things worked. Okay. And because we ended up doing a language at Xerox PARC for systems as well. And so.
And in the management of that, I guess one of the things that was being prototyped in that Carnegie Mellon practice was that it's almost a project amongst equals in a way. So the management of that, I guess by necessity, can't be, top down, because
well, there was always a professor,
I guess so,
leading the activity in general. There may have been a few cases where just a bunch of students did something, but by and large, it was under the oversight of a professor, and partly because they did want the students to graduate, and the professor could sort of figure out how to find thesis topics for the the students who were engaged in it.
And you were using the computer that you and Carnegie Mellon, I guess, in general, were focused on was the DEC PDP-10, is that correct?
Correct.
And Gordon Bell was a professor in computer science and electrical engineering at Carnegie Mellon during your tenure there. That
is
right?
Absolutely correct.
Did you have exposure to him?
Oh, sure. He was my hardware professor.
Oh.
Gordon's mind was so fast that I believe there are sentences that were used during that course which are still not complete, because he would think of something new halfway through the sentence and go there. We as students would just sort of laugh and say, "Oh, that's Gordon." No, but he was a great guy, and I've gotten to know him. He lives in Los Altos, or did live in Los Altos, and so went to work for Microsoft, though.
And I'm just looking at my question list quickly. I would just wondering if, in terms of sharing the work that you were doing on optimizing optimizing compilers and also on Bliss. Were you just your exposure to that ARPA community, and were you learning of other organizations and meeting other people? Is there anything that stands out from your CMU years in terms of the...
Yeah, well, many of the people that I met as fellow graduate students there, some of them eventually I hired. When we came out to California, a fellow by the name of Bill Paxton, who was working in artificial intelligence. So when I took hardware, it was Gordon Bell. When I took artificial intelligence, it was Alan Newell. I mean, it's like getting the gospel from the original authors. And so it was an incredible place. And you felt it was incredible when you were there. It's now 50 years later, and you look at it and you say, wow, that was an incredible place.
Absolutely. So when your dissertation work was coming to a close at Carnegie Mellon, and you're thinking about what your next step is, were any other organizations trying to recruit you to join them?
Yes. I was approached by a bunch of folks at Digital Equipment, including Gordon Bell, to come to work there. I was also approached by a good friend of mine who had graduated a year ahead of me at Carnegie Mellon, Jim King, who had joined IBM Research in Yorktown Heights, and I went there to interview with them. And then I also had two friends of mine who graduated a year ahead of me from Carnegie Mellon, Ed McCrite and Jim Mitchell, who had been hired at Xerox PARC, and they invited me to come out and interview here. And in fact, the principal recruiting person was Bob Taylor, who knew me because of ARPA, and Jerry Elkind, who was the head of the computer science lab, came to visit me while I was working on my thesis at Carnegie. So they wanted me definitely to come to Xerox PARC, which I did.
Could you tell us about, as you're comparing these, three very excellent places, you have two that I guess are essentially, East Coast and better established, and then you have this, West Coast outpost of Xerox, which at this time is a 2-year-old laboratory. And just about your thought process. And
it was actually closer to a 1-year laboratory.
Pardon me.
Yeah. There were like a dozen employees when I came to interview. It was the people. The people at PARC already were people that I respected. I knew a lot of them by reputation and/or I had encountered them. Peter Deutsch, whom I put to sleep during my talk. He had been up all night doing something. And Bob Metcalf, and just an incredible group of people. And I just wanted to work with them. Pretty much independent of what my job would be. And in fact, my first job was to finish the clone of the PDP-10 called Max, and work on that project before I got involved in doing some other kind of research. So.
And so you came to visit PARC.
Right.
And had you been to California before?
I had. I'd been to, my parents used to love to travel by car. Oh. So we had driven out, when I was in high school, we had driven out to California and visited San Francisco and went down to LA and so forth. So I was familiar with it, and I loved it when I saw it as a young person, and I wanted Nan to see it because she had never been there. And the other place that I interviewed with as well was the Los Alamos Labs in New Mexico. One of the lab directors there had encountered me at Carnegie and asked me to come. And when I had Nan visit Los Alamos, she said, "We are not coming here." And but she did love San Francisco, and so it was a no-brainer from her point of view. And from my point of view, the people I was going to work with, I felt really strongly that would be a great place for me.
What was your, Bob Taylor seems to have been, a very charismatic figure, and I think also it seems in some ways he could be a divisive figure, if that's not an impolite way to say it. But what was a strong character by any measure? Could you describe because you came into his computer science laboratory. Could you talk about your?
Yeah, well, it was really co-run by Jerry Okind and Bob Taylor. They didn't always agree on certain things. And eventually, Jerry ended up leaving, and there was a lot of sort of skirmishing for control, which I don't think is relevant to this part of the story. But for whatever reason, Bob Taylor took a real liking for me and really wanted to be my mentor and wanted to make sure that I got an opportunity to take on more and more management responsibility. And so he really was an advocate for that. And so, I always felt close to him in that regard, although sometimes I found him also a little difficult to deal with. But, everybody's like that.
Sure. That Bob Taylor's interest in mentoring you, particularly in this direction of management, was that something was he seeing something in you that you didn't necessarily already see about yourself, or was that
I never thought of myself as a quote manager, but I did think of myself as someone who could organize a group of people and keep them focused on getting something to happen, and I guess was just part of my DNA that I didn't try and develop by a title or anything like that. It's the way I was. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I felt most fortunate is I made two incredible hiring decisions while I worked at Xerox PARC. The first was someone named Ed Taft, probably the best programmer I've ever known in my life. And I hired him right out of his undergraduate program from Harvard University, and he came out to work with me on finishing Macs, and then he went off to work on the Ethernet protocols with Dave Boggs and Bob Metcalf, and eventually came to work for Adobe and helped finish the PostScript language, and he's an amazing guy. And the other great hire I made was my partner, John Warnock, who I brought in as chief scientist for a new lab I was going to start. Bob Spinrad, who was running the computer-related labs at Xerox PARC, had offered me that opportunity in 1978, and I hired John in 78, 79 timeframe.
And that was something that I was trying to piece together. Was it the case that, you had this offer from Spinrad to set up the Imaging Sciences Laboratory, and then you brought in John Warnock to be your chief scientist for almost before the laboratory was fully set up?
Yes.
Is that okay? Now I get it.
Yeah, and he came in, and and a few other people had already joined the group as well. And eventually then we got to the point where the lab became established, And Bob Taylor made sure I was located next to CSL, which was fine.
To go back a few steps in PARC, you come out, I guess the push to complete Max was an urgent priority for the laboratory.
It was. And we were right at the point of starting to, it was becoming a complete enough project that we could actually start porting the 10X operating system to it.
Were you working on that part of
Yes.
it? Okay, I see. And then it seemed to me that fairly quickly the Mesa language project starts to take form. Was that right? Was that pretty
Right.
soon
It
thereafter?
was, you could think of it as doing Bliss in a different environment.
Interesting.
And it was to have a higher level language for doing systems development at PARC, and that was the idea behind it. It was influenced to a certain extent by algol, and so it had some roots in that area. And there were a variety of us all working on both designing the language and then my principal responsibility once that was finished was to build the compiler.
Oh, I see. And how did that effort sort of first take form? Was that something that
Butler Lamson was really supportive of it, and so he sort of recruited me and a bunch of other people to sort of work on both the language. We brought in Jim Morris, who had gotten his Ph.D. at Berkeley, and he worked for a couple of years on language design with us. So it was quite a group of people all engaged in it to make that happen.
And what I was curious about also was the connection with the effort on the alto. You know, how, because I believe that, was it early on with the alto, people were using this other language, BCPL or something.
Right.
And then at a certain point in time, it seems that the majority of people using altos were using Mesa, that there was a kind of a shift.
Yeah, but Mesa actually was going to end up having more effect on the D machines, you know,
Yes,
the next
later
generation.
Why was that?
Well, because they were bigger, faster, and we could customize the instruction set to match what Mesa was producing. So the optimization wasn't just in the compiler, it was also in the design of the instruction set.
Oh, I see.
And that we couldn't do that in the Alto. Oh, we did do some of it. We put some microcode in there, but
Right.
it was easier to do it on the D machines.
Oh, so it might have been the case
The
that
Dover, not Dover, Dorado.
the Dorado.
Dover was a printer.
Right. And the people, right, because people must have been
So
using
Chuck Thacker and people like that.
the alto as a tool to develop
Right.
those next systems. So let's see. So the Mesa effort was that your focus for several years?
Yeah, I'd say about 4 years maybe.
Right.
I don't remember exactly the numbers, but it was something like that. And then towards the end of the Mesa project, that's when we decided to put on a demonstration for Xerox management about the future. and I was recruited to be part of the team to do that.
Who recruited you to do that?
It actually came down from George Paik and Bob Spinrad, Harold Hall, several of the management people there. And so that was an interesting project, and that's probably a whole thing we should talk about separately at some point.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, it was, the scale of it is quite extraordinary, and I would love to hear the details of that, because
Right.
it seems like you eventually came to shoulder much of the responsibility for that overall, didn't you?
A lot of it.
Yeah.
Certainly for the technical side.
Right.
And we just did a program here at the museum a while ago. And so
Yeah.
we'll talk about
We'll
that more.
return to that. Was it? I was wondering if the timing of, the offer to create this new laboratory at PARC, the Imaging Sciences Laboratory, to me it seemed to maybe, I was curious if it reflected two things. One, you pulled off Futures Day, or your role, that was a major accomplishment, but also that just the entire world of laser printing, the kind of full graphical orientation of the Alto and its software, and the whole idiom of kind of networked personal computing had really, it had really gotten to kind of a serious point of development. And
that's
yeah.
when Steve Jobs came to visit the Smalltalk group and saw that, it just opened his eyes to what the potential could be.
Right.
And that's just from the point of view of how a user was going to approach a computer in the future. And we had already done a lot of work in the area of networking and laser printing and so forth, and all of that had been developed at PARC. So it was all the ingredients for what became the Office of the Future were pretty much in place there by the late 70s.
Right. And the mandate of your new laboratory was going to be to really
focus on the graphics.
Focus on the graphics.
And focus on the ability to develop ways to print everything that a printing press could print. Because the idea was that you ought to be able, with a laser printer, to print not only high-quality typography, but all kinds of artwork graphics, as well as photographs by half-toning them. And there was no reason why you couldn't do that, except we had not built the software and the ability of the printers to receive something at a high enough level of description that they could do that.
And would this also have been to more fully integrate color into the whole?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Because in addition to the black and white laser printers, we also had a color laser printer. In fact, when we went to show the Office of the Future in Boca Raton, we took both the black and white and the color printer to demonstrate.
Was color, did you and your colleagues view color as a major challenge?
A major opportunity is the way I think of it. It's sort of inherent in graphics in general, and it was obvious that not only would displays but printing devices have color, because people were used to having color on the printing press for a long time, and that's what my grandfather and father had worked on.
Right.
So I knew that's what everybody wanted, and so did most people. It's just a question of how do you get there with digital technology, and that's what this lab was going to work on. And that's the reason I hired Warnock, was that he not only understood graphics from the point of view of designing what appears on a monitor or a screen, but he also was very familiar with all the issues associated with taking that screen and reproducing it on paper very effectively.
Maybe we could talk for a few minutes about how you came to be aware of both Ed Taft and John Warnock. Did you, particularly Taft, if he was an undergraduate, had you had prior exposure?
Bob Metcalf walked into my office one day and said, "One of the brightest guys I've ever met at Harvard is graduating. You gotta hire him."
Oh. Very good recommender.
Yes. And of course he had been back there, and so he knew.
And how did you become aware of John Warnock?
Well, I'd known him by reputation. In fact, I saw him give a talk at Carnegie when I was a graduate student. He gave a talk on his thesis, but I never actually dealt with him directly. And I was just aware of him from things that he published, and I knew he was in the Bay Area. And a good friend of him, his I have to do some reading. Newman.
William Newman.
William Newman, thank you. William Newman was working at Xerox PARC, and he knew that I was involved in getting this graphics lab, and he said, "You really ought to talk to John." And he had tried to get John to come and give a talk there, and it's, for whatever reason, it hadn't worked out. So I called him up, and I said I was starting a new lab, and I didn't realize when I made the phone call, but he was in the process of being told by Evans and Sutherland that he had to come back to Salt Lake, which he didn't really want to do. At any rate, we talked, and we agreed we'd have lunch. I show up for the lunch, and he had a beard. I had a beard. He was still married to the same woman he married originally. So was I. He had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. I had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. He was a mathematician. I was a mathematician. He was an ARPA guy. I was an ARPA guy. But the real killer was we both refereed AYSO soccer.
That clinched it.
That clinched it. So I got him to come. He gave a talk, interviewed, and the rest is history.
I guess I wanted to ask just a little bit about, in this whole area of computer graphics, how, at the time, how important was Evans and Sutherland? You know, if you can, in the landscape of people working in this, how important was that outfit?
They were important for doing sort of real-world visualization systems.
Yeah.
And in fact, the big project that John had done for them was to build a simulation of the port of New York,
Right.
harbor of New York, so they could train ship captains without having to put them in the water, but to do it from computer monitors and displays. So in sort of big environments like that, systems like that, they were extremely influential. And the people who founded Evans and Sutherland came out of the University of Utah, and so that's the kind of research they were funding there. And whilst John's thesis was more mathematical than programming, it was about graphics and so forth. So he was just a natural to go into that business. And though his first job at NASA was working for Evans and Sullivan, but as a contractor with NASA, he was trying to get the ILIAC computer up and running and finished, and so he worked on that for a long time. But then he started working on this other project for ENS, and in the process, built a language for describing graphics. And so when we started to do similar work at Adobe, we actually took a license from our Evans and Sullivan, so there would be no question that, we were copying something
Right,
from them or
right,
whatever.
in kind of recognition of that
Right.
connection, which I take it turned out to be have importance later on in defending against court challenges or lawsuits or something like
Oh,
that.
yeah, there was, we never got sued by anybody about that in particular. But there was some stuff with the company in San Francisco that we eventually bought.
Aldous?
Huh?
Aldous, or was it Macromedia?
Macromedia. Yeah, we had a bit of a duel on a couple of things there, and that became part of it, but it wasn't a major ingredient in the whole thing. And Xerox was also concerned that maybe we had taken away something, and so it was important that they understood that whatever we did was something that really came out of Evans and Sullivan and what John had done there. And
Right.
that we had licensed it.
Had you given much thought to the connection between computers and graphics before you got to PARC, or was PARC a place where your eyes were really open to that?
Yeah, it was
connection?
mostly at PARC. I had not had any exposure to it before then. I mean, there was stuff going on at Carnegie, but I was never part of it.
Right. And did that, when you saw the developments going on with, the laser printer and with, all a computer so focused on delivering graphics to the screen and graphics to the laser printer, did that make sense to you? Was it kind of an aha?
Yeah, I don't know if it was an aha because I saw it over such a
I
long
guess
period
so.
of time.
That's true.
But it felt very natural. It felt like, gee, why hasn't this already happened? And there were a lot of issues to be resolved before you could get there. But that was something that was clearly, from my point of view, an obvious direction to take. And both John and I had the vision that there's no reason why the printing and publishing industry couldn't go fully digital. And that's really was our original goal with Adobe.
In terms of creating the imaging sciences laboratory, was that the case that were you kind of given a mandate about kind of generally how large it could be and what its mission would be, or or was that something you negotiated, or how'd that
No,
work?
I just think instinctively the people at PARC, mostly at PARC, wasn't so much back in Rochester, but at PARC, knew that there had to be more, for this to work for Xerox, there had to be more focus on the relationship between laser printing and the computer in order for Xerox to really focus on that and make a business out of it. That was a natural fit. And while the computer science lab was doing some of the foundational work, and the system science lab was doing some of the foundational work, no one was really focused on that per se, and that was the whole point of the imaging sciences lab, is to bring focus to that connection.
Almost to truly integrate the two, if you will.
Right. And then after we did the Vision of the Future and they started up building the Star Workstation project as a product,
Right.
I got this phone call saying, we need to print and we don't know how to do that. And so that threw us into crash mode. Mm-hmm. And we got 5 people together, and including John and myself, and that's what we did for the better part of a year. And we came up with this language called Interpress, and that's what Xerox decided it was going to standardize on it. And the frustration was that they told me that they couldn't start talking about it for 7 years because that's how long it took to bring a product out. And I said, this is not going to age well. Somebody else will do something. May not be as good, doesn't matter. They'll have 100% of the market and we'll have nothing.
Right.
So
I thought I read an interesting quote attributed to you, at least, you can tell, which was that, I think, to paraphrase, if you find yourself working on something in technology, you can be sure that other people are working on it as well, and therefore, it's actually timing is very essential.
Very critical. And it was, yeah. And we took that to heart and we focused on it. And that's why getting the relationship with Apple turned out to be so important to us, because they made it possible to make that happen. And if we knew we couldn't do a Xerox because they just didn't have the genetics for that.
And the effort to answer that call from the people developing the Star, that was really kind of building on some fundamental approaches that had already been pursued within PARC. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
And some of it was, quote, invention, but a lot of it, we pretty much knew what had to be done and how to do it for the most part. There was a lot of debate among the 5 of us about the nature of the language. John was very much pushing to be more a pure language, and some of the others were more focused on restricting that and making sure that people didn't download something that would just run in the printer forever but never print. Or,
Oh, I see. Yeah, that trade-off between kind of protection and full flexibility.
Right.
Right.
And there's always some of that.
Right. Well, it sounds like it must have been a fascinating collaboration to come up with Interpress. I think I am just trying to find the quote where it was, 5 people in multiple locations, and
yeah, John and I were the only 2 people inside the Xerox PARC building. Butler Lampson was in that time Philadelphia, because his wife was finishing at Penn. She was a medical doctor. And Brian Reed was at Stanford. And the 5th person was down in LA, and his name will come to me.
I think I may have it somewhere.
You probably have it.
Let me just see. Brian Reed, Butler Lampson, Bob Ayers, Gary Mendelsohn.
Mendelsohn.
Gary Mendelsohn. And had Bob Sproul left PARC at this point?
Yeah, he was back. I think he was back at Carnegie.
Okay, that would make sense.
At that point. He may have been consulting with PARC.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that relationship was exactly.
Right.
I mean, we still saw him periodically.
And was his work that he had done with press, how important was that as kind of a
well, it was
background
it
to
was
what you
sort of
did?
a demonstration of a way to do things.
I see.
And press was what was being, when we showed the vision of the future, it was press that was running those printers.
Right.
So it could do a lot, but you did most of the computing in the workstation before it got down to the printer. Not mumble. It's a
Right.
It's a trade-off of everything. The one thing that none of the research at PARC had done is figured out how to do topography, except by designing the bitmap of what every character would look like.
Right.
And we knew that wasn't going to work. That was the big invention that we pulled off at Adobe.
Right. To essentially
And
create
that was
mathematical.
John's experience in working with Bezier curves, which were invented by a Frenchman who was designing motor cars for the French auto manufacturer.
Renault or
Renault. Thank you.
Yeah. Fascinating. And that seems to have been those Bezier curves you lived with for a long time at Adobe Systems, I
Right.
believe. Yes.
Still do.
Yeah. Well, and was in creating Interpress, it was interesting to me because it really seemed like with all the contributors geographically spread out, that working truly using networked personal computers.
We
and
used email. We did use the telephone some. But yeah, it was very much the office of the future.
Bootstrapping the office of the future, I suppose. And I wanted to just talk a little bit, if we could, about other researchers in the imaging sciences laboratory who maybe weren't concentrating so much on Interpress, or was it kind of all hands on deck?
Well, no, it was Martin Newell was certainly sort of involved sort of conversationally, but he wasn't really part of that Interpress group. He was doing more graphics work on displays. And Gary Starkweather, who was an optical science researcher, and the fellow who did the original laser imaging on the first Xerox printer, the 9700, he was still focused on that. He did not deal with the software side of things.
And was Dan Putman part of the group at that time?
He was part of the group, but he was more focused on the electronics for controlling printers, and again, not a software person per se.
And in this general issue of really integrating the workstations with the laser printers and doing that integration, was it the case that if press had been kind of the workstation was doing all of the compute and then kind of sending the information to the printer, was part of the part of the concept of Interpress that you would have more of the computation taking place inside of the printer itself and
Right.
less emphasis on
Right.
the workstation?
And that's where press migrated over time too. It did more work inside the electronics. There was an evolution from the Dover with ears
Right.
to press, and things got a little fuzzy about who did what where.
Right.
But our goal was to make it possible that the bulk of the computational overhead would be done in the printer itself, and that the job of the workstation was to provide a description of what they wanted to have printed, but not the actual data for the bitmap.
And was that part of that decision making? Was that kind of this idea that the laser printer was going to be an expensive shared resource no matter what? So it would be better to reduce the burden on the workstations and put more of the freight onto the printer?
Yeah, plus, if you were going to have a whole bunch of people sharing that printer, then the network bandwidth for sending those huge bitmaps becomes a problem to manage.
I see.
And managing the throughput of all of that doesn't make a lot of sense. And eventually we wanted to have the ability to have a whole bunch of different typefaces, and you're going to put those on every computer? Maybe not.
Right.
No. There's all sorts of stuff to think about.
And would that also aid in the desirability of the kind of interoperability? So if you had kind of a heterogeneous collection of workstations, if they're all sending out this description in a common language.
Because the implementation of that software to do that would have to be ported to all those computers, whereas if it's in the printer, it's only done once.
Right.
And you have a lot more control over how that controller that's driving the laser printer can be used with a variety of different laser printers.
Oh, right. And were there other examples where this kind of technique or solution was used in sharing other sorts of resources or was it unique to printing?
I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question. I mean, it's a very reasonable question. It's just because of the size of the data involved, it just made a lot of sense in printers. And certainly, things like distributing electronic mail is done from a server. It's not done from every computer.
Right.
And that sort of makes sense, So there are other things like that.
So the Interpress effort really came together in the space of a year.
Yes.
And was there a particular moment when you in particular really saw that this could have a broad utility, maybe not just for the STAR, but in general?
To be honest, when we were working on it, that was not our focus. We just weren't thinking about that. We were working for Xerox. We wanted them to succeed.
Right.
And I want to make sure that people who read about PARC understand that all of us who worked at PARC had that commitment to make Xerox successful. It's just Unfortunately, the relationship between research and the running of the business wasn't always as well tuned as the research was.
Right.
So,
well, could you, there's, you mentioned this kind of experience of going to talk to, the top management of Xerox about Interpress and hearing that the cycle is 7 years. Can you talk about just who you were meeting with and what your reaction was to it, or did you try and change their mind at all, or?
No, I didn't. I mean, I was talking to some of the marketing people back in Connecticut, which is where Xerox was where the management of Xerox was headquartered, and they were just pretty adamant about that fact, that they just don't talk about Xerox technology until the product is ready to ship. And that's when I asked the question, well, when will it ship? And they said, our experience tells us 7 years. And that to me was an indication that they didn't understand the environment into which they were moving.
I see.
And in the high-tech world, 7 years is a couple lifetimes. And there was no way that this idea, once understood, was not going to be capitalized on by somebody. And whoever gets there first usually gets a lion's share of the business. And to have an impact, we just could see that wasn't going to work for Xerox, and therefore wasn't going to work for us.
What was the reaction? Did you have those conversations by yourself and then had to deliver this news?
I don't talk to myself a lot.
Well, I meant in terms of your group, yeah.
I really mostly talked to John Warnock about it.
Yeah.
And we both decided that we could get old and gray and have a great time working at PARC, but now that we saw what this idea, this potential was, we really wanted to get it out in the real world. And in fairness to us, we thought we had really the handle on inventing the way that could happen. So.
And once you broadened that focus from how Interpress would solve Xerox's needs, how did that translate in your vision to Interpress or technology like it solving a more general need amongst different companies and different users?
Well, when we started Adobe, John went to his thesis advisor, Dave Evans, in Utah, and told him that I and he were thinking of taking this out and starting a company. And Dave Evans recommended that that he get us a meeting with Bill Hambrick and Quist, to explain what we wanted to do. So we set up that meeting. We met with Bill up in San Francisco. He heard what we described, and what we described was that we wanted to start a company to build workstations, design laser printers, not the laser part, but the control part of it, and plate making equipment, and build all excuse me, and build all of the software that would put all of that together and go out and sell it to the Fortune 500 so that they could do their printing in-house. When Bill heard that description, what intrigued him was the phrase printing in-house, because he felt that the people who were doing his printing of his IPOs, the financial printers, were giving him a bad deal in terms of how quickly they turned it around, what they charged for it, and how well they were doing the job. And he said, wow, I could control that myself. And so he said, I think that's a good thing. And then he said, did you ever write a business plan? And I said, well, I've written lots of research plans. And he said, yeah, it's not the same thing. All right, I'll hire someone to work with you to write your business plan. You write your plan, give it to me, and I'll get the people to invest in it. So we wrote the plan on my dining room table with an advisor, and we did finish the plan and took it to Bill. He looked at it. He said, okay, now you got to quit your job. So John and I went home and delivered that news to our families. And I went into Bob Spinrad. John only had to tell me he was quitting.
Yeah, that was easy.
Yeah, that was easy. I had to go and tell Spinrad, who was very disappointed, but very understanding. There was some give and take about, can we do something to keep you, and so on. And anyway, we left, and we found a place to rent a couple thousand feet down in Mountain View, across from where Sun was starting to build their first set of buildings. And we hired a woman who my wife had known to be sort of our administrative assistant, somebody to answer the phone, and we started recruiting people. We hadn't been in business for very long before I got a phone call from Gordon Bell at DEC, and he said, I hear you guys are starting a business. And he said, can I come and see you? We said, sure. So he came, and we told him what we were doing, described that business plan, and he said, He said, well, I don't need computers. I'm digital equipment. I got all the computers I can deal with. And we already have a deal with Ricoh for I don't remember the speed, but pretty fast printer. He said, so I don't need the printer. He said, but I do have a couple of teams of people trying to figure out how to get the computers to talk to the printers, and they're not getting anywhere. So why don't you just sell me that software? And we said, well, we signed up for this business plan, and we have to do this and this and this by the end of our first year to get our second payment. And he said, well, when you change your mind, call me. So he left. And about a month later, a good friend of ours who had worked not at PARC, but at the place that was working on the Star Workstation, Bob Belleville, had left and gone to work for Steve Jobs, and he was put in charge of running the Macintosh project. And so he brought Steve over to see what we were doing. Went through the same explanation, and he said, well, I'm going to show you my Macintosh. You'll see I don't need a computer. I'm pretty far along with that. And I got a deal with Canon for a very reasonably priced laser printer. But I have this group of people trying to figure out how to get the computer to talk to the printer, and they're not getting anywhere. So why don't you just sell me your company and come work for me? And we said, well, no, Steve, we really want to start our own business. It's what we decided we wanted to do. And he said, well, okay, I guess I can understand that. So sell me that software. And we said, well, Steve, we have this business plan. And he said, you guys are nuts. Call me when you come to your senses. So he left. So we went to talk to the guy that Bill Hamburg had put in charge of our board of directors, a guy named Q.T. Wiles, who was not from the computer and electronics world. He had run a manufacturing business in Nebraska where it was the only business in town, and he saved it, and as a result made a lot of money and decided to get out of that business, and he became an investor in it, in some of the H&Q stuff. And so Bill had him hanging around his office, and introduced him as our chairman. So John and I go to talk to him, and he listens to us, and he says, "Well, those guys are right. You're nuts. That business plan was only there to raise the money. Now you know what your business is. You call them back and get to work." So I called up Steve. He said, "What do you want for the company?" I said, "Steve, it's not for sale. We want to start a company." "All right, let's do a deal on the software." And so we worked on a contract, and he agreed to pay us 5% of the list price of every laser printer that he sold. He prepaid a few $1 million in royalties because he wanted to make sure we stayed in business. Mm-hmm. And he bought 19.9% of the company for 5 times what the investors had paid for their shares. So our investors quintupled their money. Pretty good deal. And that made us profitable at the end of our first year in business. I don't know of any other startup in Silicon Valley who had that experience. There may have been some, but I don't know who they are. We were so fortunate.
And then did you also call Gordon Bell?
Oh yeah, and we got a deal with them, and then we started working because we needed a type library, and we started talking with Linotype, and we eventually negotiated a deal with them, and they were going to would make a plate maker that would make the printing plates digitally from the same language that we used for the laser printers. And then we decided, well, we got a European company, most of the printers, laser printers, are going to come from Japan. We better start in Japan. And to do it in Japan, we had to get a type library from the Japanese. And the leading printer and type library was a company called Shaken that was headquartered in Tokyo. So I went to Tokyo and introduced myself to the CEO, who's a woman. It was the wife of the original founder, and the founder had passed away, and she took over the business. Somewhat unusual in Japanese business. I could never get her to the second cup of tea. She just did not want to do this, didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to think about it. So our sales guy, Steve McDonald, found out that the number 2 printing company was in Osaka, and it was called Morisawa. And it turned out that Shaken and Morisawa were partners before the beginning of World War II, and together had the biggest printing company in Japan. They disagreed on the Japanese decision to go to war. Shaken supported the government, Morisawa did not. So they split the company in half. No, not really, but they split it. Mm-hmm. And Morisawa took over the Osaka business, and Shaken took over the Tokyo business. And after the war, of course, he did rather well because of what we did to help Tokyo come back to life. Morisawa was struggling. So we talked to them, and it turned out that the man, Morisawa, was the same age as my dad. And so I talked to him about photo engraving and screening, and he didn't speak English, but through the translator he understood all that, and you could tell he sort of had a lot of respect for us because we knew a lot about the printing business. So we told him, if you come with us, you'll eventually outperform Shaken. And the guy who was Morisawa's son who was running the business, said, okay, we'll do a deal. So we did a deal, and we got their type library, which was the #2 type library. And today they're the largest printing company in Japan. And they still send me a letter every year on the anniversary of when we did the deal, thanking us for doing business. And Morisawa-san also sent 2 of his nephews to work at Adobe in 1984 for us, so they could get to understand how this all worked, which was a sign of very high respect. And Morisawa-san, when I announced my retirement, is the only person in Japan I've ever been invited to dinner where he brought his wife. Never happens. And so it was fascinating. That's a long story.
Oh, yeah, but a very good one. Well, I did want to ask you about recruiting from PARC, because it seems like, well, you did bring over a quite excellent cast of characters from PARC.
We did.
Were there concerns about that? Was PARC
Yes, but
displeased?
they all came to us,
Oh,
which helped.
yes.
So Dan Putman had been talking with John and me about this process of deciding to do a company, and he had enough experience in hardware that we felt he could help us design a controller for the laser printer that we wanted to build. And so that was probably the person that was closest. And then another fella, Tom Boynton, saw that Dan was coming. He called and said he'd like to come, and he was a software guy. And then a couple more people talked to me, and then 2 people that were ARPA guys, Doug Bratz and Bill.
Let's see, I have a list of some of the Dan Putman, Doug Bratz, Bill Paxton.
And Bill Paxton. So Doug Bratz and Bill Paxton also decided they wanted to come, and they called me. And then we also eventually got a phone call from Ed Taft, who, when we had left PARC, was upset with us because he couldn't understand why we were doing this, and he thought it wouldn't work. And then he called us, and we hired him. And so we did hire a number of people from Xerox, but then we started to go outside as well.
When was had you left before Bob Taylor and a whole group of people left for DEC?
Yes, that was more than a year after we started Adobe.
Okay, that was a year later. Did
Right.
more people reach out to you from PARC after that to join you?
You know, I don't remember the
Yeah.
timing of everyone
Right.
at this point.
Right.
Our 2 sales guys, Clinton Nagy and Steve McDonald, that we hired were from, Steve had been originally with HP. Clinton Nagy was a real estate guy, and he turned into a great salesman for us. So we started hiring from a lot of different places.
Right. But it seems that with people like Tom Malloy also, that some of the people who joined you from PARC really became very long-term
Adobe employees.
Adobe contributors.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the things that we focused on was trying to build an environment where people weren't motivated to move away. And I think we did pretty well at that. And the company still does very well. We have one of the lowest attrition rates of a high-tech company. And as you become a big company, that often gets to be more and more of an issue. But to the credit of the current management at Adobe, they are doing a good job of keeping our best employees well motivated and feeling good about what they do.
No mean feat. I wanted to ask you, if I could, in just the time we have remaining today, to talk about, again, this idea that if you're working on something in technology, you can bet somebody else is also. I was interested that there seemed to be, at the same time that you were starting Adobe, a kind of a group of startups that were appearing right around the same time. I think that were aimed at this, that apparently were aimed at the same things. And to the extent that you can, I'll just list some of them, and to the extent that they were meaningful, maybe we could talk about them. There was, well, one seemed to be close to home, and I didn't know exactly when it started, but there was...
Right across the street from us, Imogen.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. What was that like as a competitor, or?
Well, they were had the same sort of concept. I don't think they necessarily knew enough about the world of printing and publishing to understand the need to, go all the way to plate making and things of that kind. I don't remember specifically. But we would see them in certain of the things, calls that we would make. Mm-hmm. But they never were a serious competitor in the sense of taking away any big deals from us. And I, at this point, no longer remember a lot about what their history was after they started.
Right. It did seem that it was part of the Stanford community that seemed to be behind that. Right. That company, people from the artificial intelligence laboratory right. at Stanford, and that's interesting. I hadn't realized they were just across the street.
We were on the second floor, though, and they were on the ground floor.
Some of the other names that I saw were ViewTech was one.
Right.
Was that... Were they generally West Coast, or were they distributed? Were there some on the East?
I think there probably were some on the East Coast. I'm not as sure I remember much about them. But if you list off names,
there was ViewTech.
ViewTech was out here.
TechSet, Interleaf. I guess ZY Vision.
Right, that was out here.
And Qubix.
Yeah.
QBIX. Did any of them, do you recall if any of these rivals gave you any particular concern, or did you feel?
Well, whenever you have people competing in the same market, you stay aware of them, you listen to what people whom you're trying to do business with, because they'll use this competitor as a way of saying, well, you haven't promised or can't do X or Y or Z. So we would learn a lot about what they were saying, about what they could do, and we came up with answers for why we could either had already done it or could do it better. And so none of them really succeeded in any significant way. But yeah, there were a lot of them around.
Would you say that with in the first, let's say, 2 years of the company, something like that, would you say that you were very active in securing these fundamental deals for the company around the typefaces with DEC, with Apple?
Yeah, we were doing that because we knew that was foundational to our longer term success. And we wanted to make sure that we kept as good a relationship as we could with the people who were in these leadership positions. And so Apple, once Steve was let go, became much more difficult to deal with, but we kept dealing with them because, they were clearly our biggest customer for quite a while.
Right.
Ironically, today, Xerox is one of our biggest customers.
Really?
Yes, their printers are, all of them, I think all of them, support PostScript. Yeah, so things come full circle.
That's great.